Good day, Yohanan.
Hi, Dan. Good to see you.
It's good to see you again.
Yeah.
We've gathered here again for another podcast episode of the Tsur Institute of Biblical Research. Today we're here to discuss biblical motifs, specifically in the book of Isaiah. We're going to be talking about the arm of the Lord and the servant of the Lord. We're going to see what those two things have in common, and perhaps maybe where they even, what's the word I'm looking for? They don't just connect, they unite.
They converge.
Converge. Excellent word. The convergence of these two motifs in the book of Isaiah. Where do we have to start to discuss those?
Well, firstly, let's say that the convergence in the end will be a huge surprise because of the actual motifs themselves. They start, if we start before Isaiah, they are very, very characteristic of what God did and how he did it for the people of Israel in the Exodus story.
So let's use this episode to lay down a foundation.
Okay.
Take us back to the Exodus, Yohanan.
Well, everybody knows the Exodus story, like writ large, let's say. But it's very, very clear that it was God's power that brought the people out of Egypt, but that he also used a human vessel. And the way that God's power is described in the Exodus story is his arm.
The arm of the Lord as a part represents the whole of the Lord.
Right.
Okay, so if his right hand or his arm are his power. I have in front of me verses in chapter 6 towards this is the beginning of the last chapter of God's dialogue with Moses when he appeared in the burning bush. And God speaks to him. He says, "Therefore tell the Israelites, I am the Lord. I will bring you out from your enslavement to the Egyptians. I will rescue you from hard labor that they impose, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great judgments." Okay, the outstretched arm obviously is his own.
It's an expression of his divine power.
When the people of Israel cross the sea, they sing the Song of Moses. Or the Song of the Sea, rather. And one of the verses, verse 16, reads, "Fear and dread will fall on them. By the greatness of your arm, they will be as still as stone, until your people pass by, O Lord, until the people whom you have bought pass by." Okay, so God's arm is his power.
It's the expression of God's power. And in an amazing way, God used a human vessel, as everybody knows, like the story of Moses. Moses tried to help his people. He failed. He had to run away. 40 years by himself in the desert, finding Jethro and his family, marrying Jethro's daughter. And then God met him in the burning bush, sent him back, and used him to bring his people out. And you just mentioned the story of coming through the sea. At the end of that story, the people suddenly realize, after being enslaved for so many years and finding it hard to believe, but now they've seen God's arm at work. But they also say, and this is at the just before the song that you mentioned in chapter 15, at the end of chapter 14, it says that as a result of this amazing act of opening the sea
and drowning Pharaoh and all
and
his
drowning the
chariots.
Pharaoh's power, then it says, "And the people believed in the Lord and in Moses, his servant." So the expression "his servant" or "the servant of the Lord" here is clearly talking about the human vessel, Moses.
Can I stop you just for a moment? In verse 31, I have the New King James in front of me. It says, "Thus Israel saw the great work which the Lord had done in Egypt." But the Hebrew behind the word work in this case is, and Israel saw the great hand that God has done in Egypt.
That's interesting.
It is. It's just a little, see, sometimes the translations, they gloss something another way. But this is another appearance of his hand.
If we can just pause a moment on that thought, it's an interesting thought that God's work is, you cannot divide it from his person.
Yeah.
His hand is an expression of who he is. His work is also an expression.
But you were touching on that verse for the latter part. And so the
For the
people
latter part.
feared not only the Lord, they feared the Lord, and they believed the Lord and his servant Moses.
Yeah.
So you have both the divine part and the human part coming together in cooperation. God and Moses in this case.
So it's very clear that God uses a human vessel, but it's also very clear that there is a huge difference between the divine power and that human vessel. We see that Moses is mentioned again at the end of Deuteronomy when he dies. Almost like this is a kind of like summary of his life.
Chapter 34, verse 5, the very last chapter of Deuteronomy, we have, like you say, a summary. And it says, "So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord." When we flip the page to the book of Joshua, it opens with similar words. "After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord, it came to pass that the Lord spoke to Joshua." So Moses becomes known as the servant of the Lord.
Although that verse is very interesting itself, because at the beginning of Joshua, it calls Moses a servant of the Lord and Joshua his servant. But at the end of the book of Joshua, that mantle of being the servant of the Lord is passed on to Joshua. But again, he's the one who God has used. So again, we see this theme in that motif of the human vessel which God has used for his work. So again, these two motifs being clearly different in the sense that one expresses God himself and his power and his work, and the other his tool, his human tool, his human vessel, to use that, who is his servant. That's the arm of the Lord on the one hand and the servant of the Lord on the other.
Okay, so if this is a good foundation in the book of Exodus to understand that the servant represents the human vessel, the arm always represents God. Take us to Isaiah. Let's give a brief overview of what we're going to be talking about over the next few episodes.
Okay, so the book of Isaiah basically takes up those two motifs and uses them generally in the same way.
Okay.
You can see in the first part of the first half of Isaiah, there's several places where the arm, where the servant of the Lord is mentioned. If we talk about servant of the Lord, in chapter 20, verse 3, Isaiah the prophet is called servant of the Lord.
Okay.
Again, a human vessel. Then in chapter 22, verse 20, there's another person, Eliakim, who is called the servant of the Lord. And in those chapters, the first half of the book, in chapter 37, verse 35, David is called the servant of the Lord. So again, in every case, it's a human vessel.
Right. There's no surprise there.
No surprise. And if we look at what we will look in the next episode a bit more in depth at what happens from chapter 40, which is very interesting. But still, we can say that very clearly the servant of the Lord, whoever is being talked about, is still a human vessel.
Right. As a prologue to the following episode, chapter 40 and on contains what many know as the songs of the servant, where there are several servants of the Lord mentioned, sometimes debated as to whose identity is being mentioned here, whether it's Israel or Cyrus or a messianic figure. And sometimes the two kind of conflate. And the debates go around where they're conflated and where they're separated.
So if we just briefly mention before we finish this episode, now we talked about the servant of the Lord in Isaiah, again, human vessel. The arm of the Lord, the same as the Exodus, is God's power and actually connected with the Exodus. So if you want to read, you've got the translation there, right? From Isaiah chapter 30, verse 30, well, you can start in verse 29 to the beginning of verse 31.
You shall have a song, as in the night when a holy festival is kept, and gladness of heart as when one goes with a flute to come into the mountain of the Lord, to the mighty one of Israel. The Lord will cause his glorious voice to be heard, and show the descent of his arm, with the indignation of his anger, and the flame of a devouring fire, with scattering, tempest, and hailstones. For through the voice of the Lord, Assyria will be beaten down, as he strikes with the rod.
Okay. So now we're talking about the God's destruction of Assyria, but he's using the motif of the arm of the Lord, and again mentioning in that the fire and the flame
And the anger.
which reminds us of the fire that went with the people coming out of Egypt. So again, we see, and this is just an example, very clearly, the arm of the Lord is an expression of God's power.
Without a doubt. I think this brings us to our time today. Tomorrow we will continue with the rest of this motif, and
Good.
we will explore further into Isaiah.
Okay.
Thanks for being with us.
Good.